Mulberry Street woke up slow, like a man with a tab he swore he would pay tomorrow. I was that tab. Name is Nico Belafonte, attorney at law, supposedly. My father, Vito, always said the law is a coat you wear to dinner, not armor for a war. Today, the coat felt thin. I wore it anyway, because rituals keep your hands busy when certainty leaves the room. The street murmured with delivery trucks and two old men arguing about coffee like it was constitutional law. I let them win. The city prefers small courtroom victories before breakfast. The phone rang at 6 on the dot. Uncle Rocco, voice like gravel rolled in olive oil. He said, "Your father is down at the club. Stroke." The words landed like a gavel in an empty room. I said I was on my way before I realized I had put on the wrong shoes. Habit can be a compass and a prank. The cab across the bridge said nothing. The meter clicked and my conscience took notes. The sky was that winter pale that makes every building look honest and every window look tired. The social club was quiet, the way a church is quiet when it is thinking. A card table sat in the corner with last night's hand still on it, kings pretending to be merciful beside queens pretending to forgive. Rocco stood near the espresso machine, chewing ice like it owed him money. He hugged me with one arm and said, "He's stable, kid." The paramedics were quick. I nodded like a man who believed in speed. He muttered about a book he should not have said out loud. Winter Ledger. It came out like confession. I asked the question with my face. He shook his head and said, "Later." At the hospital, lemons and antiseptic made a truce in the air. A doctor with calm eyes explained the damage in neat sentences. Ischemic, timely intervention, monitoring. I have read contracts that were friendlier. We went to see my father, Vito Belafonte, who once stared down a judge and a longshoreman on the same afternoon, looked small under white sheets. His eyes found me and did the counting thing. 3 short blinks. Our code from when I was little. "I am here. You are here. We will improvise." His left hand squeezed mine, then let go the way a tide lets go a pier. He asked for water and quiet. I could manage the water, the quiet less so. I put the cup to his lips, and he drank like a man paying a debt in coins. Then he rasped, "Is the ledger safe?" He said it like the ledger was a person we both disliked, but needed. I said, "I do not believe in fairy tales." He said, "Fairy tales do not keep men honest. Ledgers do. Systems outlive men, Nico." He closed his eyes, and the monitor drew a steady line, like a lawyer drawing a boundary. I watched him breathe and felt 12 again, holding my breath until he told me it was fine to exhale. Rocco waited in the hall by the vending machines. He fed $1 to the spiral that keeps snacks hostage, and came away with a peanut bar that looked like it would win in a fight. He said the ledger was real enough to get people to behave when fists were itching. A book that came out only in January. Small entries. Pencil. No signatures. No ego. He said, "Your father kept it for balance, not for blackmail." I asked the difference. He said balance makes people sleep. Blackmail keeps them out. I said I have not slept in years. He clapped my shoulder like that was the correct answer. Mara texted. She is my investigator, well acquainted with truths that refuse to put on a tie. Her message, meet at office, bring coffee that tastes like decisions. I brought 2 1/3 for whatever was waiting. The office looked like a library that went to law school and regretted it on weekends. Certificates on the wall, dust arguing with sunlight, a ficus that had heard privileged conversations and kept them. Mara wore her hair up and her eyebrows at half-mast. She said, "Tell you about winter." I told her enough to make her frown and not enough to make her quit. She slid a photocopy across my desk, Paper with that grainy gray halo that says someone used a copier that smokes. On it, a list of payments, dates in January, numbers small enough to hide in a pocket, names not written, just initials and a code like ER-17, FR-22, V big 1, my last name placed in the margin like a stray cat not sure if it lives here. I said, could be fake. She said, could be. Could also be the only honest thing in the room. She pointed at a faint diagonal line that repeated every 3 inches. Copier belt scar. Same scar as 3 other mystery exhibits we have seen in 3 other winters. Routine is a signature for people who do not sign. We ate bagels without cream cheese because luxury felt like a dare. I asked Mara what the ledger would be for if not blackmail. She said, memory. People promise big when the room is loud. January is quiet, and quiet demands receipts. She stood and crossed to the whiteboard. She wrote, purpose, custody, access, risk. Then she circled access and said, storage. If your father kept a book, he did not keep it in his kitchen. I thought of the social club and shook my head. Too obvious. She said Red Hook, like she was ordering lunch. By noon, we were at a storage facility that recently gave up pretending to be friendly. A clerk with a beard that looked contractually obligated to be skeptical asked if he could help, which means show me a court order. I let a subpoena peek out of an envelope like a shy debutante. He gave us a logbook with columns that wanted to be a novel. There it was. A shell company with a winter name renting a small unit, accessed every January 2nd at 9 a.m. Camera maintenance outages on that same morning 6 years running. New York loves tradition. He offered to escort us to the unit. I declined, because I enjoyed not being arrested. We left with copies of the logs and a note about a space heater purchase the facility recommended to winter renters. Mara said, serial numbers are honest. She called 3 hardware stores, then a 4th. The 4th remembered a man who paid cash and asked if the batteries were strong enough to outlast bad decisions. The clerk laughed at his own joke and gave us the serial. I have seen juries convicted by less. Back at the hospital, my father was awake. We tuned the radio to Sinatra, which is not a choice so much as a neighborhood close. He took my hand and said the book is not confession, it is insurance against forgetting. Men forget their promises when the room is loud. January is quiet sun. We looked out the window at a city snow that had turned into gray lace. He said, you will be asked to carry what I carried. You can set it down. I said, and let it fall. He said, and let it fall carefully. He slept. The monitor went back to drawing patients. On the evening news, the district attorney announced a press conference. Colder, sharp suit, sharper vowels. She promised movement on a long cold case. A dock worker from 98. An eyewitness ready to talk now, Benny Quire, who got his nickname because he never learned verse 2. Rocco muted the television and said, men who sing do not always pick the song. I said singers rarely own the melody. He said, but they remember it. We watched the silent DA gesturing. Even on mute, she was fluent in momentum. Night came early, the way it does when you are not ready for it. I walked back to the office. The lock showed a new scratch, thin as a doubt. Not a pro, not a junkie. Someone who believes doors apologize. I changed the locks and added a second deadbolt that sticks, which is excellent security and a daily annoyance. Mara left a folder on my desk. Inside, a photocopy of a photocopy, the copier scar fainter now, as if time could make it polite. On the bottom, a pencil note. January keeps score. She has a flair for slogans. I keep them in a drawer with my better instincts. I dreamed of ledgers once, as a kid. Not books, but sidewalks. Every square a name, every crack a promise. In the dream, I walked across them, and the concrete warmed underfoot where the promises were kept. The cold squares were the ones people forgot. In the morning, I told Baba. He said, "Good, then we do not step on the cold ones." This is the problem with fathers. They make poetry into instructions. The next morning, Mara had mapped a pattern on the whiteboard. Payments small enough to ignore, timing precise enough to survive. She circled the gap 3 winters ago, a blizzard that closed half the city and made coffee taste brave. No entry that January 2nd, but one on the 3rd, as if the book waited for the plows. She said, "Whoever keeps time like this believes in order. Order is a weakness if you know how to lean." I said, "We will lean." She smiled the way you smile when a plan volunteers. On my way to the hospital, a black sedan drifted behind me 1 block, then 2, then decided its future was elsewhere. Paranoia is a coat you hope is too warm. I bought oranges from a corner stand because the vendor shook his head at the wind and said, "This is it weather, this is attitude." He threw in 1 extra orange for my father. I added him to my private ledger of men who own their kindness outright. Vito had a good hour. We talked about baseball, because baseball is a safe language for men who want to say love without making it nervous. He told me about a time he paid a debt with a piano because cash was an insult that day. The piano was out of tune. The gesture was not. He said, "The ledger is the piano, Nico. You keep it in a room where people gather, you dust it, and sometimes you play it to remind yourself you still can." I said, "And when the strings break?" He said, "You restring gently." When I left, Rocco stopped me by the elevators. He said, "The DA will think the ledger is leverage. She will not understand it is a promise." I said, "What if we cannot make her understand?" He said, "Then we will make her fear the alternative." He has a way of making mercy sound like strategy. The elevator doors opened like curtains, and we both forgot our lines. Law firms pretend to be libraries, but the books bite harder. Morning drifted in through blinds like a cross-examination. The office was quiet except for the sound of Mara flipping files with the gentleness of a pickpocket. I boiled water because the espresso machine had decided it was an artist, not a tool. We settled for coffee that tasted like ambition and compromise. I told her about my father calling the ledger a system. She said systems have vulnerabilities. Then she drew a small square on the whiteboard and wrote, "Who holds the pen?" She had 4 columns ready. Purpose, custody, access, risk. Under purpose, she wrote balance. Under custody, she put a question mark so large it deserved its own office. Access. January 2nd at 9 a.m., red hook, routine. Risk. Whoever thinks routine is camouflage. She capped the marker and said, "People do not keep ledgers because they love books. They keep them because their memory is honest in the morning and untrustworthy by dinner." We went back to the storage facility. The clerk wore the same skepticism but a different shirt, which counts as progress. He handed over copies of access logs like a man trying not to feel implicated by paper. There was a name on the account, Winter Harbor Services. Anything with winter in the title was starting to feel like an inside joke I was not invited to. The unit size was small, the kind of small that suggests a box, not a cabinet. I asked about heaters. He said they sell out in December. People like to make sure their junk does not get cold. He laughed. We did not. Mara traced the heater serial to a hardware store 3 blocks over. The owner remembered the customer who paid cash because he had asked for batteries that could outlast regret. Apparently that line had landed, because the owner told it to us twice. He offered to sell me a space heater. I declined on principle, and also because I enjoy causing fires in rented rooms. We walked the block and looked for cameras. There were two, a laundrums that filmed everything, and a deli that filmed nothing. The laundrum owner agreed to let us review January mornings if we brought cannoli later. Commerce is flexible. Back at the office, I reviewed cases from the late 90s that had the faint smell of salt and diesel. A dock worker named Mendez disappeared. A trucker named Leary did net. A union steward filed complaints and then withdrew them after his nephew found a job as a security guard where nothing was ever stolen again. Benny Quire was a footnote in two of those files, a witness who saw fog, heard footsteps, and remembered the nickname nobody admits belongs to them. It felt like searching room service receipts for motive. The DA's press conference hit at noon. Calder looked camera-ready in that way that says I can juggle knives while reading a statute. She named the 98 case, held at a photo of a dog at dusk, and said a witness was ready to clear his conscience after years of fear. Benny smiled the way a man smiles when he has found religion and also a deal. The words conspiracy and enterprise and pattern made an appearance, the holy trinity of modern prosecution. My phone lit at with reporters pretending to be friends. I let it light up. Rocco called to say he had seen a familiar face near the hospital elevator, a councilman's staffer, a woman who always wore a wool cap like it was a second head. He remembered her from a winter fundraiser where the coffee was free and the checks were mott. He said, "Do not worry, I did not introduce myself." Rocco does not introduce himself unless he has to. I made a note to consider whether the wool cap was just a cap or a habit with a schedule. In the afternoon, I visited my father. He looked better in that way, where the color returns to a man's face and takes a seat. We turned the radio down low and listened to a ball game. Baseball is a language for men who like to talk about risk without admitting it. I asked him if he trusted Rocco. He said, "I trust him to be himself." I asked him if he trusted me. He said, "I trust you to try." He smiled like that was the highest compliment he could give, and maybe it was. He told me the ledger started with a funeral. A man had died owing nothing and everything. The neighborhood was loud with grief and quiet with blame. Vito, younger and angrier, watched men make promises they did not intend to keep. So he wrote them down. Not to punish them, he said, to protect the ones who actually meant it. A winter ritual so that summer would not forget. The first entry fit in his pocket, the last one too. He laughed once and said, "The book never got heavy, Nico. The carrying did." After visiting ours, I walked Mulberry and counted the storefronts still breathing. A butcher who cut meat like he was negotiating. A florist who arranged apologies better than anyone I know. A tailor who saved marriages one hem at a time. I wondered which names had been initials in my father's pencil lines. How many small promises had made a big difference when it mattered. The city does not run on engines. It runs on favors and the memory of them. Back at the office, Mara had a gift. She found a watermark on the photocopy that belonged to the storage facility's internal copier. The diagonal scar matched, but the paper fibers whispered something else. The copy in my hand had been produced this year, not in the year of the original entries, meaning someone had replicated a page or assembled one to look like an old page. I said, "Forgery." She said, "Collage." Forgery pretend to be someone else. Collage pretend to be everyone at once. We argued the difference the way friends argue about which pizza place counts as sacred. She said a collage is designed to persuade people who want to be persuaded. A forgery is designed to fool experts. Calder was an expert. The public was the public. Which audience did the page want? We leaned toward the public, which meant a press strategy was hiding behind a legal strategy. I sharpened the pencil and then remembered my father hates pens that erase too politely. I used a pen and wrote one word on a yellow pad. Motive. At 7, I met a source in a coffee shop that believes in scones as large as modest mistakes. He worked in city procurement and had a nervous laugh. He said winter harbor services existed on paper for contracts that never materialized, staffed by no one and everyone. The address pointed to a mailbox that pointed to a lawyer, who pointed to a lobbyist, who pointed to an empty chair. He said sometimes you build a bridge on paper to cross a river that should not be there. I said, and the ledger is the toll. He nodded like that made sense and promised to call me if his conscience insisted. On my way home, a black sedan idled at the corner and didn't move when the light turned green. I took the long way, past a wall tagged with the word patience in bubble letters. I do not believe in omens, but I respect good typography. I kept walking. The sedan stayed where it was, thinking about inertia. Sleep arrived in installments. In the morning, Mara had already made a list of every January 2nd for the past 10 years, with unusual maintenance outages at storage facilities within the 5 boroughs. The list was longer than comfort and shorter than forever. Patterns were there. Not just Red Hook, a facility in Long Island City, one on Staten Island with a camera that had allergies. She drew red circles and said, "Whoever keeps time like this likes to travel or delegates well. Either way, they love January more than rent control." Calder called. She has a way of speaking that makes you agree you have been warned. She said she was moving to impanel a grand jury on the 98 case and would be in touch about my father. I said my father was resting. She said rest is important. Then she said you should also rest, Mr. Belafonte. People make mistakes when they are tired. I said I write mine down so I can enjoy them later. She laughed, the friendly kind that means I will see you in court. In the afternoon, the laundromat footage finally loaded. January 2nd, 9 a.m. A woman with a wool cap passed by, carrying a small box hugged close to her coat. She walked like someone who had learned to make herself smaller in crowds. 10 minutes later, she passed the other way, hands empty, head down. No face clear, but the cap was distinctive and the coat had a tear at the cuff. Mara paused the video and said, "Routine is a lullaby. People fall asleep to it." I printed the stills and stared at them until the pixels threatened a union. Why carry a small box to a storage unit and live without it? Why only in January? Why the same time? Why the same camera outage? Why a collage page that wanted the public to get ready to believe? Sometimes questions are just the city saying, "Please keep up." I taped the stills to the whiteboard next to the word motive. They made a pair of eyes watching me walk. Rocco stopped by and pretended to bring sandwiches because he was hungry. He asked about the woman with the cap without asking about her. I said we were looking. He said good and changed the subject to a boxing match from 1979 that he insists had the wrong winner. It was his way of telling me he trusted me to move without inviting the entire neighborhood to the party. When he left, he squeezed my shoulder hard enough to be affectionate and almost reassuring. As Knight sat down beside the window, I opened a fresh legal pad and sketched out how a ledger becomes a weapon. First, someone believes it is a weapon. Second, someone else agrees. Third, an audience forms around the belief. The document matters less than the chorus. Benny Choir would provide the chorus. Calder would provide the stage. The collage page would be the prop. The wool cap would keep time in the wings. I wrote the word rebuttal and underlined it twice. Before sleep, I checked on my father. He was dreaming with his mouth slightly open, a habit he used to tease me about when I was a kid and then denied when it was his turn. I sat in the chair and counted my breaths alongside the monitor. Men in my family like to pretend breathing is a skill. Maybe it is. Maybe what we pass down is the insistence on counting. I adjusted his blanket and whispered, "We will improvise." He did not answer. The monitor did. Benny Choir earned his nickname the old-fashioned day. He never stopped singing, even when the song was over. Now he was tuning you for the district attorney. Calder teased the press with words like development and breakthrough. The city leaned in. I leaned back. Men who perform for absolution usually want applause more than forgiveness. Mara covered the wall with a timeline that looked like a commuter map for bad decisions. 1998, dock worker Mendez disappears. A truck schedule shifts by an hour and never shifts back. A union steward rescinds a complaint. 2012. A councilman discovers an affection for winter charities. 2020. Storage cameras discover seasonal allergies. This year, a collage page arrives to rehearse the jury for a show it hasn't bought tickets to yet. We watched an old deposition of Benny on a laptop that whined like it regretted its battery. He described fog, footsteps, and a voice he could not place telling him to go home. He placed himself near the pier at the right time and the wrong distance. He smiled when he said he was scared. Fear with a smile is a sales pitch. Mara paused the video and said he is rehearsed. I said, sure, but is he believable? She said belief is a muscle. Calder makes people work out. Calder called and invited me to coffee at a place that serves espresso with the confidence of a closing argument. She arrived early and unarmed except for competence. She said, I am offering your father something humane if he helps me put the past in order. I said, the past does not enjoy order. She said, juries do. Then she slid a draft across the table. Terms soft enough to cushion a fall. Clauses sharp enough to cut on the way down. Cooperation provisions that whispered ledger without daring to say it out loud. I made lawyer noises and said I would consider. She said, you do not have to consider long. The press likes arcs. Your father can choose his. It was not a threat so much as a weather report. I told her that arcs can break when the weight is wrong. She smiled, the kind of smile that says the weather will be what it will be. Outside, a black sedan idled with a patience I was beginning to resent. The rear window lowered 4 centimeters, the universal measurement for ICU. A camera lens glinted. Not a gun. Not comfort either. I took a picture of the camera taking a picture of me, which is childish and also the only move I had. The window rose. The sedan rolled. The street pretended none of this was happening. Back at the office, Mera had news from our laundromat cinematography. The woman with the wool cap had a routine. January 2nd, 9 a.m. Small box in, hands empty out. Same coat, same cap, same tear at the cuff. 5 years running. We still did not have a face, but we had a stride. People keep their gait even when they change everything else. Mera printed frames until the printer begged for mercy. We taped them at. The wall watched us quietly. Rocco arrived with the delicate energy of a man carrying rumors in paper bags. He said a councilman was nervous enough to ask old friends about winter habits. He also said one of Calder's investigators had been seen asking after me in a bar that did not guard anyone except secrets. I said, "Do not worry, my bar tab is boring." He said, "Kid, boring is the new brave." At the hospital, Vito had color in his face and impatience in his voice. He said, "You met her." I said, "Calder makes a good cup of pressure." He said, "Good. Then we understand each other." He told me a story about a driver who ran his route 5 minutes late for 3 years to avoid a man who argued about everything. The man moved away. The driver kept the 5 minutes. That is how patterns become religion. He squeezed my hand and said, "Do not let anyone turn our ledger into their sermon." Evening settled in like a judge who knows the verdict and enjoys the procedure anyway. I drafted a response to Calder's offer that sounded cooperative without promising cooperation, firm without sounding like I had practiced in a mirror. I removed adjectives until the sentences were honest and then added one back for charm. Mara read it and nodded once, the nod she gives when she cannot find a hole but assumes I left one for later. We dug into Benny's finances. Men who find religion also find accountants. Deposits small and irregular began showing up 3 months ago, just when a collage page could have been built from nostalgia and toner. A cash purchase at a winter fundraiser. A donation to a church that does not issue receipts that outlive guilt. Mara said, "He is paid to lie, he is paid to remember. The difference matters to him." I walked home and found my door latch sitting wrong, the way a sentence sits wrong when someone else edits it. Inside, nothing was missing, except the feeling that I would sleep. A drawer had been opened and closed by a hand that didn't understand drawers. My legal pads were in the wrong order, which is how you make me angry in record time. I checked the postcard with the 3 names, still there. I put it in my jacket pocket and sat in the dark long enough to admire my paranoia. The next morning, we visited the pier where Mendes disappeared. It is a park now, where joggers bless the ghosts with expensive shoes. The air had that salt that makes liars thirsty. Mara pointed to a spot where a camera would have been if the city had believed in cameras then. She said, "Benny puts himself here because nobody can disprove fog." I said, "Fog is very accommodating that way." We stood a while and let the wind file a report. On the way back, we stopped at a diner with eggs that didn't apologize. Rocco slid into the booth like a magician, completing a trick. He put down a folded napkin, inside a photo. The councilman at a winter fundraiser 5 years ago. At his elbow, the wool cap, face turned, profile a suggestion more than a fact. The cap had a stitched pattern, small diamonds near the brim. Details are a kind of justice. I felt something like relief and something like dread. Mara traced the cap to a boutique that sold exactly 3 of that style that winter. One was purchased by a staffer in the councilman's office. Another shipped to a sister in Bay Ridge. The third, cash. We asked for receipts, got shrugs, and left with the knowledge that someone believed in war mirrors and cold routines. We were close enough to smell motive, which smells like kitchen grease and old paper. Calder filed a motion to admit newly discovered records related to enterprise activity. Translation. The collage page wanted a badge. I prepared an opposition that described the page as derivative, cumulative, and prejudicial. The 3 horsemen of "No thank you, Your Honor." I included a footnote about copier scars because judges respect scars even when they pretend not to. That night, I dreamed the ledger was a metronome. It ticked in January and waited the rest of the year. Patient as a saint, stubborn as a habit. Every tick kept a promise from wandering. When I woke, I knew two things. First, I needed to prove the collage, not just suspect it. Second, I needed to decide what kind of son I wanted to be when the proof arrived. The second one was harder. At dawn, I wrote letters by hand to 3 people who would not expect to hear from me. A retired union steward who hated me for winning a case I should not have won. A pastor who liked my father and disliked my profession in equal measure. A cop who once said I had kind eyes and then wrote me a ticket anyway. I asked for conversations, not confessions. People talk better when they are not auditioning. The plea draft sat on my desk like a polite bomb. Calder had written it in the dialect of mercy, which is to say the penalties were gift-wrapped and the ribbons were handcuffs. Time served on a lesser count. Restitution that treated history like an invoice. Cooperation that did not say ledger but hummed the melody. I circled clauses until the page looked like a crime scene. Mara read over my shoulder. She tapped the paragraph about supplemental disclosures. She said, "This is where your father hands them the winter thing without calling it a winter thing." I crossed it out so hard the pen squeaked. She said, "They will try to put it back in through a side door." I said, "Then we will lock the side door and nail it shut for good measure." We built a counter, limited admissions, yoked to specific incidents. No enterprise language, no broad forfeiture. A cooperation clause that meant community programs and nothing with a spine. I wrote sentences so plain they were either honest or empty, which is the safest kind of plain. Then I wrote the one sentence I knew Calder could not swallow. No acknowledgement of any ledger, pattern, or extrajudicial record, physical or otherwise. It was a dare written as a definition. Rocco arrived with a folder that had been used as a coaster. Inside were photos from a winter fundraiser at a waterfront restaurant with opinions about lighting. The councilman shook hands with donors while a woman in a wool cap moved along the periphery, always to his left, always near the coats, always carrying small boxes or envelopes. The cap had that diamond stitch near the brim. Routine is shy until you stare. I sent the counter to Calder and then walked the block to avoid watching my inbox. The air had a glass edge. 2 kids argued about who invented the dollar slice. I sided with both. By the time I returned, Calder had replied with track changes that looked like a parade of red flags. She wrote, "Remove the ledger line and we can talk like neighbors." I wrote, "Keep the ledger line and we can talk like professionals." We were very neighborly about not agreeing. In the afternoon, we met a retired union steward in a diner that serves coffee that refuses to cool. He had hands like unused hammers. He said the year Mendes disappeared, a list started making the rounds every January. Numbers small enough to look like courtesy, regular enough to feel like tide. He called it the little winter. He said men were better behaved when the little winter came, because nobody wanted to be the one who owed in public. Then he said he never saw the list and the effects of it. Like wind you only notice when the door slams. Mara asked about cameras, receipts, anything that breathes on paper. He smiled and said, "Sweetheart, the thing about being honest is you do not always keep the receipt." He slid me a napkin with 3 initials and a year. ER, FR, VB. He winked and said, "Some letters are just letters." He paid in cash and left without finishing his eggs. Men who like rules rarely finish their eggs. Back at the office, the copier whined and the printer sulked. We assembled a motion in limine that called the collage page what it was, a composite masquerading as continuity. We described the copier belt scar as a repeating artifact, the handwriting ages as inconsistent with the claimed dates, the January rhythm as suspiciously theatrical in a year the city shut down for a blizzard. We did not say planted, we said curated. Judges like their insults dressed in Latin. Calder scheduled the sit-down. No cameras, just her second chair, my investigator, and 2 coffees each, because honesty is dehydrating. She led with the human card. Your father can help the city tell the truth about a dark season. I said, truth survives fine without being a press release. She said, juries want a story, Mr. Belafonte. The ledger is a story. I said, or a myth. And some myths are there to stop fires, start them. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside, the collage page. This version had a fresh stamp investigative exhibit, pending. She said, authenticate this and I can make your father's winter shorter. I said, discredit that and you can make your case stronger. We looked at each other like 2 people choosing a bridge in the rain. Mara spoke without asking permission, which is her brand. She noted the copier scar, the variance in pencil hardness, the fibers that dated the paper to this year. Calder listened like a person filing the serial numbers of a doubt. She said, perhaps your father kept his promises in an orderly way, and others emulated him later. I said, emulation is his evidence. She said, it can be effect. Effect is persuasive. After the meet, we sat on a bench outside the courthouse. Pigeons negotiated jurisdiction over a pretzel. Mara said, she is bluffing. I said, she is lying either. She has a piece of something and wants the rest to appear by force of narrative. We looked up at the windows, where juries pretend to be immune to gravity. I said, we have to find the box. She said, the one the wool cap carries. I nodded. Boxes are rude that way. They insist on being found. Evening brought a call from the pastor who tolerates me for my mother's sake. He said a woman from the councilman's office asked about our parish pantry ledgers, whether we keep names, whether we accept donations in January. He laughed and said, I told her we accept donations in all months, even the sinful ones. Then he turned serious and said, careful, Nico. People who take notes on the poor are rarely writing a love letter. I visited my father. He was awake and watching a game show that believes luck is a virtue. He muted it and said, you will be tempted to make a speech in court. Do not. Jurors enjoy speeches until they do not. Tell them a story with a lock on it, then hand them the key. I said, and the ledger. He said, do not bring a piano to a knife fight. We smiled at the old metaphor and made it ours again. Mara called from outside the waterfront restaurant. She had watched the back door through 2 deliveries and a broken smoke break. The wool cap appeared. Same stride, same tear at the cuff, carrying a small box with the care of a person who believes cardboard can save lives. The cap got into a rideshare, went across town to a storage facility in Long Island City, and walked out empty-handed 9 minutes later, January 2nd on a different shore. Routine travels well. We expanded the map. Maintenance outages bloomed on the calendar like frost. Red Hook, Long Island City, Staten Island. Each with a camera that took a nap on January 2nd, then woke refreshed and useless. I drafted subpoenas for maintenance logs and heater purchases and anything that might confess to routine under oath. Mara said, "Someone is going to call us obsessive." I said, "Good. Obsessive is how you spell thorough, when you do not want to sound annoying." Rocco reported that the councilman had started using the phrase legacy in sentences that did not require it. Men use legacy when the mirror gets honest. He also said someone asked after Mara by name in a bar with a generous pour. He told me not to be a hero. I said I am a lawyer. He said, "That is it's the upgrade you think it is." Near midnight, I stood in my kitchen with the postcard in my hand. 3 names, 1 crossed, 1 circled, 1 underlined. I said them out loud like a prayer for people with mixed results. I thought about the difference between balance and leverage, between promises and pressure. The ledger had been a fence to keep the animals in, not a weapon to hunt with. Somewhere along the way, someone started selling tickets to the zoo. I wrote my father a letter I would read to him in the morning, explaining the offer or counter, the risks. I ended it with a promise he didn't ask for. "I will not trade your piano for someone else's press conference." Then I laughed at myself for talking in metaphors like a man trying to pick a lock with poetry. I put the letter in my jacket and finally slept. Mornings at the hospital taught me that time can be loud. Machines beeped like impatient metronomes. Carts rattled past doorways with the rhythm of a rehearsal that never ended, and somewhere a television argued about game shows. My father was awake and not impressed by any of it. He said, "Read the letter." So I did. I told him about Calder's offer and our counter, the parts that looked like mercy and the parts that tasted like leverage. He listened like a man counting cards. When I finished, he said, "Good. Now throw it out and write the real one." I asked him what the real one was. He said, "The one that starts with 'This is who we are' and ends with 'This is who we will be if we aren't careful.'" He took the postcard from my hand and tapped the names. Crossed, circled, underlined. He said, "The crossed one is already paid. The circled one still believes in the old way. The underlined one thinks he invented gravity. Start there." Then he closed his eyes and drifted, leaving me with instructions disguised as philosophy. On Mulberry, the butcher sharpened knives with the serenity of a monk. He slipped me a bag of bones for soup and said, "You look like a man who needs broth and boundaries." The florist waved a rose like a flag of truce. The tailor said my coat fit fine, my shoulders did not. I walked to the office, feeling like a man narrated by his neighbors. Mara was already at the board, adding circles like a cartographer of stubborn facts. We agreed to push length where it matters. Not padding, density, more witnesses, more paper, more city. Mara QD 3 interviews. First, a longshoreman who used to share cigarettes with Mendez and owed my father a favor he pretended not to remember. Second, a clerk at the Red Hook facility who had a memory for shoes. Third, a woman at the councilman's district office who used to be an intern and now believed in calendars as a lifestyle. We blocked out the day in ink. The longshoreman met us on a bench with a view of the water and no nostalgia. He had a face that made you want to tell the truth or lie better. He said Mendez was careful and brave. He worked the night he vanished because he swapped shifts with a guy who liked payday more than sleep. He remembered a truck idling where trucks did not idle, and a man with a cough that sounded like gravel, arguing with a radiator. He remembered the cough because the man did not smoke. Then he looked at me and said, "I always thought your father kept the hotheads from setting fires. If he wrote things down, it was to stop hands from doing what mouths promised." He would not see more, But he would see it again, exactly the same, which is how you know a story has a spine. Mara wrote down cough like gravel and underlined it twice. Then we walked the pier until the wind edited our courage. The river does not keep secrets, it keeps time. The storage clerk at Red Hook had a talent for noticing what people pretend to hide. He remembered the wool cap because the diamonds near the brim made him think of a sweater his mother hated. He remembered the small box because it had a strip of tape torn and retaped, like someone needed to check that the contents had not sprouted legs. He remembered the smell, like graphite and old envelopes. He remembered the habit of paying for 1 month in cash every December, a superstition of renters who believe January deserves a clean slate. He said, "The camera outage is scheduled by corporate. I do not know why." I said, "I do." We crossed to the district office and asked to speak with anyone who controlled the calendar. The receptionist smiled the way people smile when they are deciding whether you deserve the script or the improvisation. The intern-turned staffer met us with a planner the size of a pastry. She was proud of it, as one should be proud of tools that keep chaos at heel. She said January was always busy for the councilman. Ribbon cuttings, donor breakfasts, committee preps. I asked about a winter fundraiser 5 years ago at a waterfront restaurant. She said yes without checking the book, and then checked the book anyway. Yes, she said again, and her yes tasted like memory plus ink. I asked if a staffer had reason to visit storage facilities in January. She laughed like I had asked if the office visited Mars on Tuesdays. Then she stopped laughing, because Mara slid a steel frame of the wool cap across the table. The intern's face rearranged itself into caution. She said, "I do not know her." Which was not a bad answer, just a small one. I thanked her for her time and left a card. People who love calendars eventually write you in. Calder filed our motions and her own, like a pair of boxers shadow boxing in adjacent mirrors. We asked the court to exclude the collage page as unreliable, curated, prejudicial. She asked the court to admit it as effect, enterprise, and context. The judge set a hearing 2 weeks out and advised counsel to avoid trying the case in the hallway. Everyone smiled and planned to do exactly that. To push length with purpose, I built the record we will need if we lost the motion. I drafted subpoenas for heater purchases, maintenance logs, entry key audits, and the entire corporate policy on camera eatages. I asked for the names of every contractor who touched a lens in January for the past 10 years. I asked for training manuals, because sometimes the truth hides in the boring part of the binder. Judges respect boring when it is relentless. Mara chased the wool cap to Bay Ridge. The boutique's owner remembered the diamond stitch and the winter it outsold good sense. 3 caps sold in that exact pattern. 1 to a staffer paid by the councilman. 1 to a sister who takes long walks in cold weather. 1 in cash to a woman who didn't offer a name and did not need to. The owner remembered the tear at the cuff. He said she caught it on the handle leaving the shop and did not notice. Details love to introduce themselves twice. Rocco shadowed a fundraiser that believed in shrimp cocktails and plausible deniability. He watched the councilman shake hands with men who gave generously and never made eye contact with their own shadows. He watched the wool cap move like a comet around the sun, carrying small boxes, collecting envelopes, leaving smiles. He noticed a cough. Gravel. He followed the cough to a man who did not smoke and did not drink and left early, alone, with nothing in his hands and purpose in his walk. I met the retired cop who once called my eyes kind and wrote me a ticket anyway. He sipped tea like penance and told me the '98 case was the kind that made good cops sad and bad cops busy. He said There were whispers of a list that settled debts without paperwork, and that the winter after Mendez, the pier was quiet. He said quiet is underrated. It means men are thinking. He warned me that Calder would frame our ledger as control. He said, do not fight her theory with air. Bring her a heavier theory. I said, balance. He nodded. Back at the hospital, my father listened to my day like a man evaluating a chessboard without touching a piece. He said, do not be afraid to admit what the ledger was. It was a tool. Tools can build or break. If you make the jury choose between believing we were saints and believing we were sinners, we will lose. Give them the middle. Give them men trying, failing, and trying again with a pencil because ink was too proud. We added more scenes because scenes are where juries live. Mara scheduled an interview with the heater distributor's regional manager, a man who believed in clipboards and quiet authority. He brought spreadsheets that smelled like victory. Purchases spiked each December at 3 specific facilities that also recorded January outages. He did not know why. He did know that one buyer asked specifically for a model with a thermostat because paper does not like extremes. He laughed at his own joke and then apologized to paper. The laundry room footage gave us a small miracle. A reflection in a window as the wool cap passed. Not a face, but a badge lanyard, flipped backward, with a metal clip engraved with a tiny logo. The logo matched a non-profit, with winter in its title. The non-profit's mission statement loved neighborhoods and transparency, and gave grants to causes that looked good on postcards. I printed the logo the size of a dinner plate and taped it to the wall. Calder called to see Benny would be meet the grand jury next week, and that my father should decide whether he wants to be a character in the story or the author of his own epilogue. I said epilogues belong to readers. She said juries are readers. I said then, let us give them a better book. We were very polite about the fact that we were not changing each other's minds. To make the chapter earn its keep, I did the mundane work that saves lives in court. I backed up files to 3 places because paranoia pays dividends. I printed key exhibits on thick paper because judges do not like fragile ideas. I rehearsed questions out loud in an empty conference room because questions behave better when they have heard themselves before. I asked Mara to play Benny. She did a passable impression of a man who belongs on television. Night fell with the confidence of a closing argument. I walked to the river and practiced telling the story out loud, the way my father taught me when I was a kid with a stutter and stubbornness. I said the ledger was a winter ritual to make summer honest. It was not control, it was memory and math. It kept hotheads from burning the neighborhood because they knew January would arrive with a pencil and a question, did you keep your word? I said it again and again until the words stopped performing and started working. On the way home, I passed a church where the door was open and the heat was on. A woman lit a candle for someone she missed and then one for someone she was trying to forgive. I am not a religious man, except when I am. I lit one for Mendez and one for the doc, and one for anyone who believes in small entries that keep bigger promises alive. Then I added a 4th for my father, who taught me that the point of a ledger is it the lines, it is the space you leave for tomorrow. Back in my kitchen, I wrote the real letter. It started with "This is who we are." It ended with "This is who we will try to be." In the middle, I put the part where men remember better in January because someone asks them to. I folded it, put it in my pocket, and set an alarm for early. Tomorrow we would find the box, or the person who carries it, or the reason the box exists when stories would do. Either way, a debt was coming due, and I wanted exact change. Leaks sink ships, and also families. In the morning, Mara laid 3 phones on the conference table like we were about to play a game where trust loses. She said our junior paralegal had been taking photos of prep notes, not for money, for insurance, against a cousin who collected debts with enthusiasm. She had the messages. They tasted like fear and spelled panic wrong. I fired him gently, which is to say I did not ruin his life in front of him. I told him to disappear in a direction that did not include my calendar. He cried a little and said he was sorry, and I believed him, which is both a strength and a hobby I should quit. We changed our protocols from digital to footsteps, paper, hand delivery. The copier groaned like an employee who suspects the layoffs are coming. Mara implemented a low-tech lockdown, colored folders, sign-out sheets, initials that mattered. She wrote a list on the whiteboard titled "Holes in the Boat" and started patching with tape and stubbornness. I called the court and asked for a protective order on sensitive materials, the kind that comes with frowns and threats. Judges protect process because process protects them. Rocco suggested we take a day to breathe. I suggested he try being me for an hour. He laughed and brought cannoli. He said the councilman was asking around about a woman with a cap who used to be a ghost. He said ghosts get nervous when someone starts remembering their names. He also said a truck from a certain union yard had been seen near the Long Island City facility at 9:12 a.m. on January 2nd. Routine attracts witnesses. We visited the union yard. A foreman with a sunburn that never healed told us trucks go where schedules tell them, and schedules answer to money. He let us see logs that didn't mind being watched. A truck left at 8:50, returned at 9:40, recorded destination as supplies. Supplies is a word that does not incriminate or enlighten. The driver signed his initials with a flourish. Men who flourish tend to overcompensate. The driver met us in a diner where the coffee was more honest than the pie. He wore a jacket with a stitched name that didn't match the one he offered. He denied knowing the storage facility and then remembered he had dropped something off near there once, maybe twice, hard to say. His cough sounded like gravel arguing with a radiator. Mara wrote cough on a napkin and underlined it twice without breaking eye contact. He looked at the napkin and decided to remember he had someplace to be. Back at court, the clerk scheduled our motion hearing for a judge who dislikes theater and tolerates plot. Good. We filed a supplemental declaration with photos of copier scars, maintenance outages, and a modest essay on the sociology of routine. I kept the metaphors out because judges prefer their poetry in footnotes. We pushed length the only honest way, by doing the work. Mara canvassed storage facilities in Staten Island and found the same January nap. Different brand of camera, same corporate memo. I traced the non-profit logo to a grant report with inconsistencies shaped like intentions. Rocco walked the councilman's district like a man measuring a suit no one ordered, counting who said hello and who looked past him. At the hospital, Vito listened to our leak story and nodded like a man who has patched worse boats with worse tape. He said, "Forgive the kid fast and yourself slower." Then he told me about the time he had to remove a man from the ledger. The man kept taking credit for paying on time while forgetting that his payments came from other people's pockets. Vito erased his initials with the steadiness of a surgeon. The winter after, 3 fights did not happen because of it. He said, "Sometimes subtraction is mercy." The next day we rehearsed Cross for Benny. We built questions like scaffolds, each one designed to hold the weight of the next. Mara played Benny with alarming accuracy. She smiled when the lie needed sugar and frowned when the truth needed company. We anticipated Calder's redirects and wrote notes for the words we hoped we would not need. Preparation is a superstition you can defend to strangers. I walked past the waterfront restaurant and counted cameras and regrets. The wool cap appeared like a small moon in daylight, moving boxes the size of confessions. I did not follow. Not because I am noble, but because I needed the paper, not the chase. I texted Mara the time and the route. She was 3 blocks over, ready to catch the reflection in a different window. We had become people who photograph glass. The boutique owner, called to see a woman, came in, asking if they still stocked the diamond stitch cap. They did not. He remembered her hands. The tear at the coat cuff had been mended by someone impatient. A zig where a neat person would zag, a detail to love later. We thanked him and promised to send business his way, which is the city equivalent of a prayer you can keep. Calder invited me to a pre-hearing conference in her office. The room knew its angles. She offered water like a person who respects hydration as a power move. She said, "Nico, we both know there was a system that kept the neighborhood a little quieter than it had any right to be." I said, "Quiet is a crime." She said, "Control is." I said, "Control is only a crime when it hurts people." She said, "It did." I said, "Sometimes the absence of a fire looks like censorship." We stared at the word "sometimes" until it shrugged. She asked what I was afraid of. I said, "Bad faith." She said, "Mine or yours." I said, "Either." She nodded like we were co-authors of a cautionary tale. Then she said, "I can give your father something that looks like grace if you stop pretending the ledger is a ghost." I said, "Ghosts are just people we refuse to remember correctly." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. To lengthen without dilution, we built out the neighborhood. I met the barber who keeps a ledger of his own. Not for debts, for compliments owed. He writes down the nice thing you refused to say about yourself and charges you later. He told me my father once paid for a haircut with advice and a favor redeemed in January. He said the advice grew interest. He said the favor saved a wedding. This is what cities are. Compound interest for small mercies. Mara found a maintenance tech who had been paid cash to perform camera updates on specific mornings. He liked to talk about firmware the way some men like to talk about fishing. He said the outages were scheduled because the network needed a reboot. He also said he never saw a manager on those mornings or a woman with a cap who knew the code and signed with a pen that left no groove. He admired her efficiency and remembered nothing else, except the coffee she brought was strong and sweet. Hospitality is a form of camouflage. At night, I drafted the opening statement I might never give. I kept it clean and quiet. I wrote that the state would show you a page of Januaries and ask you to see chains where there were only threads. They would ask you to believe memory is a weapon and ritual is conspiracy. I would ask you to believe in neighborhoods that learn to keep their promises on paper because mouths are unreliable narrators. I crossed out the best line because best lines love attention more than verdicts. Rocco called with a small emergency that felt large. Someone had left an envelope under the office door with a single photocopy inside. The collage page, again, this time with one entry circled in red pen that bled through, FR22. The paper smelled like a basement and a dare. I put it in a plastic sleeve and said thank you to nobody. We checked the church basement where poker loves to pretend it is fellowship. A man there owed my father enough to offer a memory. He said, FR used to be a man who always paid on time because his wife kept the books. When she died, he stopped paying and started drinking, and then started paying again when a pencil showed that each January. He said the pencil was not a threat. It was a reminder that somebody noticed. He cried and then lied about crying. We thanked him and offered to forget the life. The judge issued an order compelling the storage company to produce full maintenance records. A courier delivered a thumb drive the size of a confession. We opened logs that smelled like litigation. Outage schedules, technician rosters, ticket notes complaining about cold rooms and glitchy timestamps. In one entry, a note. VIP request to minimize lobby presence during service window. VIP. The wool cap had nice manners. We correlated heater purchases with access logs and found a perfect imperfection. 1 January 2nd, the heater model changed because the store ran out of the usual. 2 days later, a return for the original model. Someone cared enough about consistency to make extra work. People reveal themselves in what they repeat. They reveal themselves more in what they correct. At the hospital, Vito took the postcard and underlined the underlined name again, as if emphasis could become a lock. He said, when a man thinks he invented gravity, you do not argue physics. You hand him a weight and wait. I asked how long. He said, as long as it takes to watch him notice the floor. We laughed softly, because that is the only volume certain truths allow. Before sleep, I wrote a list titled, What We Can Prove. I wrote routine across sites, scheduled outages, heater purchases, wool cap, non-profit logo, councilman orbit, collage page fresh fibers, Benny's finances, cough like gravel. Then I wrote what we cannot. I wrote who holds the box, where the original pages live, who planted the prop, whether mercy will be understood. I folded the list and put it with the postcard, 2 pieces of paper, one for memory, one for hope. Morning brought a gray sky and a list of errands that had aspirations. We had a motion hearing looming, a ghost in a wool cap, and a cough that refused to be anonymous. Mara labeled a stack of folders with dates, and the office began to sound like a train station where the trains keep their promises. We started at Long Island City. The manager had the expression of a man who has learned to fear clipboards. I showed him the court order and watched his frown evolve into compliance. He produced contractor logs, key swipe histories, and an incident report about a thermostat that decided January was optional. The report included the phrase VIP masking request. I asked who the VIP was. He said, a foundation liaison, Winter Harbor. Mara traced the liaison's name to a payroll file. The address was a co-working space with good coffee and bad acoustics. We found a desk with a plant that looked like it had decided hope was a hobby. The receptionist said the liaison worked remote on odd days. Today was odd. We left a card and a reason that sounded like courtesy. Courtesy is a better snare than threat. Rocco called with an update on the cough. The driver with the stitched jacket had not returned to work. His supervisor said he was on family leave, which in this context sounded like a euphemism for structured absence. Rocco said he saw the man once before at a fundraiser, standing near a coat rack like a man guarding his own alibi. He also said the councilman had used legacy twice in a short speech and once in a hallway. That is enough legacy for a week. We pushed the map wider. Staten Island yielded a facility with a mural of a lighthouse in the lobby and a log of outages shaped like a habit. Same date, same hour, same coffee purchase at the corner bakery by a woman in a wool cap who tipped well and didn't speak much. The cashier remembered the diamond stitches and the coat cuff mended by impatience. Details are the city's way of saying you are close enough to trip. I filed supplemental exhibits at court, each one a quiet brick in the wall we hoped to build. The clerk stamped them with a noise I find more comforting than most lullabies. Calder's office filed a reply that admired our vigor and questioned our conclusions, which is the legal equivalent of saying nice shoes and then stepping on them. At lunch, we sat across from the river and ate sandwiches, with the seriousness sandwiches deserve. Mara said, "The wool cap is it hiding. She is performing maintenance. The routine keeps the volunteers honest, the donors happy, and the books balanced in a way that does not involve auditors." I said, and someone decided to turn that into a weapon. She nodded. The collage page is a trailer for a movie. They need a jury to finish. The liaison called. She agreed to meet at a cafe that believes in natural light and muffins you need two hands to regret. She wore no cap, only a careful face. She said the foundation supported winter programs, including storage for seasonal supplies. She said the January outages were unfortunate coincidences. She said she did not know Benny. She said the councilman was a friend to neighborhoods. It was a lot of say. Mara asked about small boxes. The liaison blinked and said boxes come in many sizes. I asked about the wool cap. She smiled as if we had complimented a secret. Then she said, "People like to be useful. If a cap helps them feel that way, who are we to argue?" I asked if the cap had a name. She said everyone has a name. Then she left us a receipt for 2 coffees and no answers. We returned to the office and found an envelope under the door. Inside, a photocopy of a page with 3 entries, each with initials, each with a January date, each with a number that looked like a debt paid in precise slices. FR, ER, VB. The same initials from the Union Steward's napkin. A note in block letters said, "January lives here." The paper smelled like toner and a basement. I called the steward. He answered on the 3rd ring and said he was at a funeral where laughter was allowed. He confirmed the initials and added a story about VB, who used to run a pickup game behind a grocery where the rim was forgiving. VB paid his debts and made sure everyone else did too, not with fists, with reminders. He said he never saw a ledger. He saw fewer fights. Then he apologized for the background noise of grief and hung out. We built a theory board with 2 paths. Path A, the ledger as control, Calder's preferred story, with Benny as chorus and the collage as prop. Path B, the ledger as balance, a winter ritual that kept tempers inside their coats, with the collage as imitation and the cap as logistics. The councilman stood between them like a man trying to look indispensable to both. The motion hearing arrived with the punctuality of dread. The judge wore patience like a cape. Calder argued effect and context, said the page explained the arc, not just the facts. I argued curation and contamination, said the page risked turning an evidentiary hearing into a screening. I showed the copier scar, described the paper fibers, narrated the January outages like they were dull on purpose. Dull wins more often than fireworks. The judge asked one question that mattered. Counsel, what is the state's good faith basis to claim this page is a record from the relevant period? Calder cited chain of custody light. I cited physics and trees. The judge took it under advisement and said we would reconvene when boring had done its work. Court adjourned without applause, which is how you know it went fine. Outside, reporters practiced sincerity. I gave them a sentence and a half. Calder gave them a parable about winter promises and community harms. Benny emerged long enough to pretend he had somewhere to be. He had the smile of a man who enjoys the idea of courage. The cameras enjoyed him back. We celebrated by not celebrating. Back at the office, Marat discovered that our paralegal had tried to message the cousin again and failed, because the number was now a ghost. She said, "Leaks seal themselves when the water gets colder." I said, "Good." Then I wrote a thank you card to the copier for its scar. It did not respond. Night brought a visit from the liaison. She arrived without an appointment and with a decision. She said the cap's name was Lucia. She said Lucia did the January runs because she believed consistency was a kindness. She said Lucia would not meet with us because Lucia did not like being named. She did, however, provide locations. Red Hook, LIC, Staten Island, same windows, same lols. The liaison said she was tired of being useful to men who used usefulness like a mirror. Then she took back her plant. We hit Staten Island at dawn. Mara parked where cameras could see us because honesty enjoys an audience. Lucia arrived on foot, cap on, box hugged close. She moved like a memory that did not need names. We did not approach. We watched the reflection in a glass door reveal a face shaped like resolve. She entered, stayed 9 minutes, left empty-handed, turned toward the bus stop where the schedule was an optimist. Rocco followed the cough to a walk-in where the buzzers had peeled labels. He listened to the wheeze of a stairwell and found a door with a mat that said home anyway. The driver let him in because Rocco can talk to doors. Inside, a man with eyes that had learned to inventory exits. He denied everything until Rocco said, "Your cough is a tell." Then he admitted to deliveries labeled supplies, boxes to rooms with heaters, signatures that respected invisibility. He did not know what was inside. He did know who ordered the runs, a staffer from the councilman's office, the one with the wool cap. Back across the water, I visited the pastor. I asked about Lucia. He had a way of not answering that always felt like a favor. He said, "Some people take on jobs that keep others from becoming their worst selves. They do not ask for credit because credit would ruin the job." He added that the pantry's ledger was short on names and long on quantities. Boxes in, boxes out. No initials, no totals that looked like pressure. He said, "We try to keep our math boring." The liaison texted an apology for the plant and a photo of a sign-out sheet from the foundation. Names redacted by someone who loved thick markers. The pattern still sang. January 2nd, Lucia. Heater key, storage escort. A scribble that looked like the councilman's scheduler. Boredom was beginning to testify. Calder called to see the judge was leaning toward the limited admission if the state could show independent corroboration. I thanked her for the hint and pretended not to notice the bait. She said, "Nico, I need the page. You need your father. We can both win." I said, "I am not allergic to win-win. I am allergic to magic tricks." She laughed softly and said, "Then keep your eyes open." We ended the day on Mulberry. The butcher asked if we were eating. The florist demanded we take a plant we will kill. The tailor tutted at my shoulders and said, "Posture is a policy choice." Neighborhoods write their own closing arguments. I walked the block with Mara and felt the city breathe with us. January lived here, yes, but so did patience. So did the long game. At home, I laid out the postcard and the new photocopy. FRERVB, January dates, numbers careful as handshakes. I wrote a question on a yellow pad. Who benefits from turning a lullaby into an alarm? Then I wrote a name I was not ready to say out loud. I put the pad face down like guilt. Before sleep, I called my father. I told him about Lucia, about the liaison, about the driver's cough finding a voice. He said, good. Remember to honor the people who do the quiet labor. Juries like heroes, but they trust workers. I said, and the ledger. He said, tell them the ledger was a broom. It swept. Sometimes it swept hard. But the point was not the sweeping. It was the floor you could live on after. The morning felt crosswise. The sky could not decide if it was overcast or thinking about it. My coffee staged a walkout halfway through extraction. Even the elevator paused between floors like it needed a ruling. Mara arrived with a look that said the day would not be patient with us. She was right. First stop, the courthouse. The judge wanted to hear from experts on paper, like we were auditioning cellulose. Calder brought a forensic document examiner, whose resume could stop traffic. I brought a materials scientist, who smiles only when polymers behave. The examiner testified about handwriting characteristics that persist across time. The scientist talked fibers, fillers, and the romance of wood pulp. Judges love wood pulp when it sounds like math. Calder's expert floated the word consistent. Mine stapled the word modern to the page. He identified optical brighteners that entered common use years after the entry dates. He showed the copier belt artifact repeating like a chorus line. He did not say fake. He said assembled. The judge wrote something down and frowned at the page like it had failed a quiz. We left with no ruling, which is its own kind of gravity. Outside, reporters collected adjectives. I offered none. Mara and I walked 3 blocks without talking and then decided to talk too much. We made lists while moving. Questions for Lucia that would not feel like accusations. Questions for the liaison that would. The liaison met us in the co-working lobby because transparency enjoys glass. She looked less careful today, which can mean honesty or fatigue. She said the foundation began the January runs to align donations with need. She said the councilman's office encouraged the schedule because predictability photographs well. She said Lucia was the only person she trusted with the keys because Lucia never improvised. I asked who added heaters. She said the storage managers preferred warm paper. It sounded adorable until you remember juries. We asked about Benny. She said she knew him as a story and a warning. Men like that make careers in other people's recaps. She had never met him. She had, however, met the driver with the cough. He complained that the elevators were slow. He liked coffee sweet. He never looked at her face. She remembered this because people who do not look at your face are trying not to know you. Mara peeled off to run down a rumor about a 4th site in Sunset Park. I went to the hospital. My father was awake and pretending the broth was good. I told him about the experts and the brighteners and the copier's chorus line. He laughed and said, "Never underestimate a machine's desire to be recognized." Then he said, "Do not gloat if you win that motion. It just makes the next one taller." He asked about Lucia. I said she was ritual with legs. He closed his eyes like a man listening to a far radio. He said, Make sure she is punished for other people's ambitions. He said this the way you say, remember to breathe in winter. Back at the office, an envelope waited. Inside was a set of photocopied tabs from a bound book. January markers. Someone had flagged FR in 3 years, ER in 2, VB in 1, as if frequency needed a chart. A note. You keep asking why, but January only asks who showed up. The handwriting was not familiar. The attitude was. Rocco reported that the driver with the cough had checked into an urgent care and then left without seeing a doctor. He also reported a staffer from the councilman's office shredding documents so enthusiastically that the shredder protested. He concluded with a culinary review of a sandwich we would never eat because it sounded like a crime. Mara confirmed Sunset Park, smaller facility, same winter heartbeat. The manager there remembered Lucia because Lucia returned a lost key card by mailing it to herself care of the office, then delivering it in person. People who respect systems also respect their alibi. We decided to talk to Lucia. Not a confrontation, a walk. Mara suggested the board walk in Staten Island, early, when the day is still deciding. Lucia arrived on time, because of course she did. The cap stayed on. Her eyes took inventory and then rested. She let us walk beside her, the way a city lets a parade happen. I said we were trying to keep good work from being turned into a spectacle. She said spectacle pays salaries. I said not mine. She said exactly. Then she told us about January like she was reading from a manual. Keys signed out, boxes moved, heaters checked, doors verified, lists reconciled, receipts gathered, names avoided. She liked avoiding names. Names travel badly, she said. Mara asked if anyone ever asked her to copy a page that looked older than it felt. Lucia smiled at the ocean and said a girl has to have boundaries. Then she said, people like to keep faith in tangible form. If you give them a list, they behave like the list is a promise they made to themselves. If you take the list away, some of them forget who they wanted to be. I wrote this down and wished every jury could hear it exactly as she said it. I asked if the councilman's office directed any of it. She shook her head. They did not direct. They gestured. Gesture is how power keeps its shoes clean. When I asked about the collage page, she made the face of someone who expected to be disappointed. She said she had seen sloppy copies and precise ones. She had never seen a page that smelled like the past. We left Lucia with a thank you and a promise to keep her out of crossfire. Promises are cheap. Keeping them for people who never asked is the expensive part. The judge ruled after lunch. Limited admission denied without prejudice. Translation at today. He cited modern paper, the copier artifact, and the risk of unfair prejudice. Calder's jaw did a small yoga pose. Mine stayed still. Mara allowed herself a nod. We will fight this again later, but later was a gift. Calder called within the hour. She said, congratulations. Now tell me how you plan to keep your father out of a different kind of trouble. I said, by telling the truth as it behaves, not as it performs. She said, the truth can perform when asked politely. I said, then stop asking so nicely. We were unreasonably fond of each other's stubbornness. To build length that didn't sag, we did chores with teeth. Mara compiled heater serials across all sites and found that 2 units had been replaced, the same year Lucia took over keys. I drafted letters to donors, whose January generosity spiked like a stock tip. Rocco mapped the councilman's winter calendar against ribbon cuttings and found a neat overlap with storage runs. Optics do not prove anything. They do, however, audition. In the evening, we held a meet with neighbors who owed my father nothing except opinions. The butcher, the florist, the tailor, the barber, the teacher who runs the after-school program with gum and miracles. We asked what January felt like before and after the pencil. The teacher said fights used to bloom in March. After the pencil, kids arrived with apologies ready in January. The barber said he had fewer IOUs taped to his mirror. The butcher said knives argued less with the bone. The florist said roses lasted longer, but that might be the heater. We wrote it all down. Lucia texted the time and address without commentary. We showed up at a church basement that smelled like coffee and concrete. On a table sat a small banker box. Inside, envelopes labeled by year, each with a handful of index cards. January notes. Not debts. Promises. Fix Mizar's gate. Replace bulbs in the playground. Cover Mr. L's prescription gap. Fund 8 uniforms for the team. Initials appeared only when someone needed reminding. The handwriting varied because the writers did. No totals, no balance due, just tasks and check marks by spring. Mara looked at me like the floor had arrived. I looked back like my shoes had opinions. Lucia said, "People confuse order with control. We just do not like dropping the same plate twice." She let us take photos and then took the box away again. She said, "This does not enter court." I said it should not have to. Rocco called from a sidewalk that owed him better lighting. He said the driver with the cough had friends who suddenly wanted to help him move. He said boxes were leaving the walk-in. He said the councilman's scheduler bought a shredder. He said legacy had become destiny in a speech draft he saw over a shoulder. Rocco is very tall. I visited my father and read him the inventory of the banker box. He closed his eyes and nodded once for each line, like punctuation. He said, "That is the thing I meant when I said balance. Not numbers, weight. You keep the neighborhood from tipping." He took my hand and said, "If they make me an emblem, make sure the emblem is a broom, not a crown." Before sleep, I wrote a new opening line. The ledger you will hear about, is it a bill? It is a list of chores a city assigns itself every winter so that nobody forgets to be the person they promised to be. I put the line away. Best lines are dangerous when you love them, but some truths want a good suit for the walk to court. The banker box would not leave my head. Tasks, not totals. Promises, not pressure. If a jury could hold those cards in their hands, the story would walk itself to the right door. But courtrooms are at basements, and evidence has rules even when truth begs for exceptions. Mara arrived early with bagels and a war plan. She wanted affidavits from people whose names had appeared as initials on the index cards without exposing the cards. Proof by orbit. We will show that January had chores and spring had check marks. Quiet work, loud pattern. Judges like patterns that behave. We split the list. I took the teacher, the barber, and the widow whose gate squeaked like a confession. Mara took the pharmacist, the parks guy, and the youth coach who can coax a team out of chaos. Rocco took the cough. He did not ask permission, and I did not offer it. The teacher handed me a folder that looked like it had earned its life. Receipts for bulbs, sign-in sheets for volunteer Saturdays, a photo of kids with new uniforms lined up like punctuation. He said the January list kept adults honest. Kids notice honesty the way they notice candy. Then he asked me if the case would make the list disappear. I said we would try not to let it. He said, try harder. The barber showed me his mirror with fewer IOUs taped to it. He likes to write the good things down instead. He keeps a ledger of compliments owed. He flipped through pages like a priest previews a sermon. On January 12th, he had written, "Tell Mrs. P. Patience saved the kid." He had forgotten to collect. He smiled and said, "I will do it today." Men who keep small promises live longer in other people. The widow's gate squeaked and then did not. She remembered two teenagers who arrived with a bag of tools and a note. No names, just a time and a promise. They fixed the hinge, oiled the latch, and left so quietly she wondered if she had dreamed it. She kept the note in a drawer next to her husband's watch. She did not show it to him. She did not have to. Mara reported similar stories. The pharmacist had a receipt stamped with a handwritten thank you that matched no known hand. The parks guy kept a spreadsheet of bulb replacements that coincided with January notes like dance steps. The coach had a donor list that aligned with uniform purchases and a schedule that aligned with storage runs. We were building weight, that volume. Rocco called with gravel in the line and in the lungs he was following. He said the driver had moved boxes out of his apartment and into a friend's garage. He also said the friend had an opinion about my father that was not polite. Rocco has a way of rephrasing impoliteness into strategy. He said the boxes contained papers that smelled like copy machines. He said, "Please bring gloves." We met at the garage, which had aspirations of being a storage unit but lacked the paperwork. The friend had a face that could hold two ideas at once, shame and defiance. He said, "Take what you want and leave with evening." Inside the boxes, we found tabs, dividers, photocopies, and an index of initials with years next to them, not unlike the tabs we had received anonymously. No originals, only echoes. One tab read ER21, another FR22, VB19. The handwriting had the neatness of someone who knows their work will be judged by strangers. In the margins, notes like, "Explain this to donors without sounding like math." We photographed everything and bagged the tabs like artifacts from a politely run cult. The driver watched with a cough you could navigate by. He told us the councilman scheduler had instructed him to move the boxes. He said the scheduler used the word archiving with a wink large enough to count as punctuation. He didn't know where the boxes were headed next. He did know the scheduler favored January like a lucky tie. Back at the office, we spread the photos across the table. The collage page looked less like a weapon and more like marketing. Calder could argue effect until the end of winter. We had found intention rehearsing in the wings. Mara built a chart that correlated tabs with donor nights and press hits. It sang a harmony we did not enjoy. Calder called as if she had seen our table through the wall. She said, "I heard you had a productive afternoon. I said we had a busy one." She said, "I have a draft with fewer ribbons and more handcuffs if your father decides to be courageous." I said, "He was courageous when courage was unpopular." She said, "Then let him be again, but this time in writing." I visited Vito and read him part of the draft, because sons are reckless. He listened, and then he took my hand and squeezed a rhythm that felt like January. He said, "If the choice is between being used and being blamed, choose neither." He said, "Tell the truth like you owe it rent." He said, "If you can keep Lucia safe while you do it, then you deserve your name." We asked Lucia if the banker box had cousins. She said yes, but the cousins were scattered like careful seeds. She said the point was, Not to prove anything to people with microphones. The point was to get things done. She admitted she had refused to copy anything that pretended to be older than it was. She called those pages nostalgia with a law degree. The liaison texted a time and an address and the word alone. I arrived at a storage unit 2 neighborhoods away. Inside, more boxes, but these were boring. Seasonal decorations, chairs that refused to stack, program flyers. She pulled a smaller box from behind the table. Inside, a notebook. Not a ledger, a journal, her handwriting. Notes on volunteers. Notes on who showed up in January when it was cold and who only showed up when a camera did. She did not want to give it to me. I did not want to take it. We agreed on notes and copies. In the journal, a pattern. When the councilman's office leaned in, Lucia backed out. When Lucia leaned in, the office scheduled a photo. When donors needed a story, January expanded. When the neighborhood needed something fixed, January stayed the same size. The difference between legacy and chores is complicated if you know whether a camera is present. Rocco brought news that made the air narrower. Benny had a new apartment. It belonged to a friend of the councilman. The friend owned businesses with the word consulting in their names. The rent was an insult to arithmetic. Benny's smile was now a leaseholder. We expanded affidavits. The teacher, the barber, the widow, the pharmacist, the parks guy, the coach, all agreed to swear to what they could see and touch. We avoided the word ledger. We used the word list, because list does not bring luggage. We built a packet that felt like a neighborhood introducing itself under oath. Calder's office sent over a notice for Benny's grand jury appearance. It was theater on paper. We will not be in the room, but we will be in the hallways, listening to the echoes. I made a list of questions I would have asked. Mara made a list of answers he would have given. We both were probably right. At dinner, the butcher told me that men are easier to feed than to convince. He wrapped steaks in brown paper with a seriousness I reserve for affidavits. He said, "January is it a month. It is a promise you make to yourself after you have had time to think." He slid me a small packet of sea salt and said, "For luck." The judge set a date for a status conference. Translation: bring something new or bring better manners. We aimed for both. Mara mined maintenance logs for names that kept recurring at odd moments. One technician showed up on 3 sites, always in January, always signed off by a manager who later moved to the councilman's district office. The circle closed like a patient trap. We found the technician. He liked code and disliked attention. He said he had been hired on a referral from a non-profit liaison whose plant had a difficult year. He remembered Lucia as the person who made sure he had a badge and a coffee and a time window that didn't invite cameras. He remembered the scheduler as a person who loved clipboards out loud. He said the outages were innocent. The timing was thus his idea. He shrugged like a man who knows the difference between fixing a thing and make it look fixed. At night, I called my mother because I was losing the argument with the ceiling. She told me stories about my father that had no winter in them. Summer stories, breezes and vendors, and small kindnesses that do not appear in ledgers because they evaporate into habits. She said he taught the block to count to 10 before it counted who was to blame. She said he is more than a pencil. I said I know. She said, then write him that way. Before sleep, I laid out the affidavits, the photos, the charts, the journal notes, the garage tabs, the maintenance logs. Names had weight now, not just initials. The story could hold itself up. I wrote one more line for an opening I still might never give. We are here to talk about a pencil that kept time so men could keep theirs. Then I put the pen down, because sometimes restraint does the heavy lifting. The finale didn't announce itself. It arrived like January does, on schedule and indifferent to your opinion. The status conference sat on the calendar like a small word with large consequences. Calder was ready. We were ready. The city seemed amused. I visited my father before court. He looked more himself, which is to say, he was practiced at pretending he felt fine. I read him the current draft of the opening line I might never speak. He listened and said, "Keep it shorter." Then he took my hand and said, "Whatever you do not let them make our neighborhood a villain for learning to keep promises out loud." Outside the courtroom, Benny rehearsed charm. Reporters hovered, microphones angled like flowers that had learned to beg. Calder brushed past and nodded at me, a professional truce. Mara arranged our folders the way a stagehand arranges ropes, quiet and exact. The judge entered with the confidence of a person who has seen every trick twice. Calder began. She framed the case as an overdue correction. Patterns, enterprise, the hidden tyrannies of small rituals. She conceded the collage page for now, but promised corroboration forthcoming. The court hummed with interest because promises are entertaining. I spoke next. I said the state had mistaken a broom for a crown. I did not say ledger. I said list. I did not say control. I said chores. I held up affidavits that swore to bulbs and benches, gates and uniforms, January work that made spring less fragile. I kept my voice even, the way you speak to a skittish truth. We submitted the maintenance logs, the heater serials, the technician overlap, the liaison statement about predictability for optics, the chart that tied donor nights to storage runs, and press photos to expanded Januaries. Not to exonerate a myth, to shrink a myth back to human scale. The judge listened like a man at a window deciding about rain. Then came the echo of the grand jury. We were not in the room, but hallways talk. Benny told a version that placed him at the dock and near the truth without touching it. He mentioned the list, called it a tax. He mentioned my father, called him a keeper. He left out the people who benefited and included the people who made good enemies in headlines. He had learned which names have weight and which do not. Rocco texted that the driver with the cough had gone to ground. The councilman's scheduler had discovered an affection for off-site storage. The liaison was looking for a new job that didn't involve hand signals. Lucia was on her route, which meant the day would keep moving whether or not we kept up. The judge asked a question that didn't sound like a question. "Counsel, what would justice look like without the noise?" Calder said accountability. I said proportion. He nodded as if those were synonyms in a language he recognized. He scheduled an evidentiary hearing on the maintenance and the January routines. The collage page would stay outside for now, pacing. Outside, the councilman gave a statement about legacy that sounded like a mirror congratulating itself. Reporters nodded because cameras respect sentences that wear suits. I watched Lucia pass behind the crowd, cap down, box close, invisible by design, not a symbol, a person doing a job. We needed a choice. Calder called with hers, a narrowed offer, no admission of any ledger, no enterprise language, a plea to account so thin it could be folded into a receipt. Community service defined as tutoring and park cleanups. Time served. A statement in allocution that acknowledged the neighborhood had sometimes needed reminders in winter. She said, "Meet halfway." I carried the offer to my father. He read it like a man reading a weather map for a walk he intends to take. He said, "Will this let you tell the truth?" I said, "More of it than I expected." He said, "Will it let them keep their chores?" I said, "Yes." He leaned back and closed his eyes. He said, "Then say yes before weather changes its mind." We negotiated commas and promises. Calder wanted a sentence about leadership. I wanted one about humility. We found a verb they could both live under. The court set a date. The city set a mood. The neighborhood kept breathing. The councilman's scheduler panicked in public, which is to say, he smiled too hard and pretended shredders are recyclable. The driver with the cough reappeared long enough to hand Rocco a thumb drive with documents that proved enthusiasm had been mistaken for policy. The liaison landed a job at a different foundation that did not stage generosity. Lucia refused to take credit for anything except returning keys on time. On the day, my father wore a suit that belonged to a younger man and a dignity that belonged to him. He stood straight. The allocution was short. "Your Honor, winters are hard. People make promises in summer they forget by December. In my neighborhood, we started writing them down. We did not always do it right. We did not always do it kindly, but it helped keep the peace. If I failed, I am sorry. If I helped, it was because other people did the work, and I wrote the reminder." The judge accepted the plea. No prison. Community work. A lecture circuit of exactly 1 block. The court moved on because that is what courts do, and we were left with a winter that felt less like a verdict and more like a plan. After, the butcher, the florist, the tailor, the barber, the teacher, and half the neighborhood formed a parade with no music. They shook my father's hand and told stories like receipts. Lucia nodded once and disappeared into the kind of anonymity you have to practice. Rocco held out a paper bag like he had stolen it from a happy ending. Calder walked with me down the steps. She said, "I wanted more." I said, "Me too." She said, "We didn't lose." I said, "We didn't lose." I said, "We didn't lie." We stood a moment in that rare weather. Then she said, "Take care of your father, Mr. Belafonte." I said, "I am learning to." We spent the next week doing the kind of community service you cannot sentence a man to. We replaced bulbs in the park, fixed a gate, bought uniforms, sat with a widow who missed the squeak because it sounded like company. We wrote nothing down. The chores got done anyway. At night, I walked Mulberry and thought about the weight of names. FR, ER, VB, names that had learned how to balance. Benny would sing until the song wanted to be something else. The councilman would rename legacy as listening. The driver would inhale without gravel. The liaison would teach a plant to forgive. Lucia would keep time. My father sat by the window with a blanket and an opinion. He said, "This city survives because people keep a private calendar of decency." I said, "Should we write it down?" He said, "Sometimes. But mostly you just do the thing and let the paper stay blank." He smiled in a way that made the room warmer than the heater ever did. I took out the postcard with the 3 names, crossed, circled, underlined. I added a 4th mark, a small check next to the word January, not because we were done, because we were more. I put the card away and turned off the light. The street exhaled. The ledger myth could go argue with itself. The list would be here in the morning.